investigation into singer David has intensified after the body of a teenager was discovered in a Tesla that has been linked to
It started as a whisper on the internet, messy, distant, easy to scroll past. Then a Tesla linked to a rising star was towed, opened, and everything changed. Inside the trunk, police found the body of 15-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. The discovery ended the rumor phase and launched a full-scale investigation that froze a career, canceled a tour, and left the industry speechless. Authorities haven't announced charges or a cause of death. The timeline is still forming, and each new detail raises harder questions than the last. What is clear is chilling enough: the car was marked, cited, impounded, then searched. The girl reported missing in 2024 was found weeks later, and the case moved from online speculation to the center of Los Angeles news.
I didn't kill her physically, but in the back of my mind, she died.
Detectives served a search warrant at a Hollywood Hills residence tied to the artist, while family and fans mourned at a funeral 1 month after the discovery. Facts are scarce, emotions are not, and the gap between them is where the story now lives. According to the internet's earliest threads, it didn't start in a studio or a green room. It started in a Fortnite lobby. A teenage boy chasing a breakout moment met a girl who treated his songs like a lifeline. He was about 16 or 17. She was barely 12. Even before anyone saw red flags, the age gap made people uneasy. What looked like a harmless connection already felt like a line being crossed. From there, listeners began mapping songs to dates like detectives with yarn on a wall. March 28, 2022 became the first pin. That's when the track Decide dropped, and fans swear a line about save your tears 7 years sounded less like poetry and more like a countdown. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was everything. Either way, the lyrics stuck, because once the internet latches onto a number, it never lets go.
This album is my life. Like, Withered is my life. Petals of Thorns and Lost Petals are what I wanted my life to be, and then Withered is my life.
Then came September 7, 2022, her birthday according to the threads, another release. Romantic, too neat to be random, too on the nose to dismiss. People called it a tell, critics called it a reach. But once a date matches a song, the theory writes itself, and the timeline started to harden in public. Around that period, he spoke about his work like a diary with a lock torn off. This album is my life, he said in so many words, separating older projects from the one that felt like a mirror. Fans took that as permission to read everything like confession. Titles weren't just titles anymore. Track lists became coordinates. Snippets turned into hints. The story wasn't just being written, it was being scheduled. By the end of 2022, the pattern felt set. Private contact online, public breadcrumbs in the music. Whether those clues were real or imagined didn't matter yet. What mattered was momentum. The audience had a theory. The dates seemed to match, and the next chapter was already queuing up. But that wasn't the whole story. By early 2023, screenshots began floating from Discord like driftwood after a storm. One line kept reappearing in reposts. Is Celeste in here? Short, casual replies followed, the kind you barely notice until you look back with different eyes. On its own, that kind of message is nothing. In context, it started to feel like breadcrumb number 1, open, traceable, and too risky for someone who wanted distance. Not long after, a Twitch moment turned into gasoline. The two laughed on call about touchy topics, the kind that makes a live chat lean in. Then the mood snapped. His voice shifted. He asked her to delete the VOD. That pivot from carefree to concerned became a clip people replayed frame by frame, calling it the tell that he knew the conversation had crossed into dangerous territory. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he recognized the line too late. Either way, it fed the timeline the internet was already building without him. By February 2024, the alarms weren't just online. Her mother filed the first official missing person report. The threads caught fire. Commenters began tagging him relentlessly, accusing, theorizing, counting down to an arrest that hadn't happened. Then photos surfaced, fresh ones, suggesting they were still together even while she was listed as missing. Suddenly, the story wasn't a long-distance rumor. It was proximity. It was proximity plus a police report. Spring made everything messier. She vanished again. She came back, then she was gone for good. And yet she never fully disappeared from his orbit. People pointed out glimpses backstage, a username that looked like hers on a server, a song reference that seemed too pointed to be a coincidence. It's the kind of drip that drives audiences a little bit insane. Nothing explicit, just enough to feel undeniable. Under every new upload, a version of the same comment kept climbing. Drop the one with the missing girl, Celeste. It read like pressure. It read like a dare. nowhere. Looking back, those months feel like the hinge, the point where a fandom turned into an investigation with millions of amateur analysts. Theories multiplied faster than facts. Every emoji, every caption, every change to a bio got treated like a code. He could post a lyric and people would run an autopsy on the punctuation. She could go silent and the void would fill itself with guesses that hardened into lore. And hanging over all of it was an object nobody paid enough attention to at the time, a card that would sit, get cited, then vanish into impound before anyone outside the case realized how important it would become. No one knew it then, but the timeline wasn't just in DMs and songs. It was stamped on parking slips, tow logs, and the kind of paperwork that doesn't care about rumor. The internet was convinced it had the story. It didn't. The part that changed everything was still waiting in the dark. Late summer turned the rumor mill into a crime scene. A Tesla registered to him was hauled off, processed, and opened. Inside, detectives found Celeste. Overnight, the story stopped being maybe and became a timeline with dates, tow slips, and chain of custody. Blogs ran with the ugliest version. Threads repeated a word no mainstream report would print. Whether that detail was true or just online hysteria, the impact was the same. The narrative jumped from speculation to catastrophe. What followed was the quiet part that always says the most. The tour vanished from calendars with one update, playlists thinned out, collaborations went dark. A legal knock sounded at a house tied to his manager, and suddenly everyone around him spoke in PR sentences. Careful, sanitized, one step away from denial without actually saying anything. The label didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't cushion the fall. They cut the cord like it was on fire. Online, he moved even faster. Posts disappeared, old comments got scrubbed, stats locked, streams went silent. It looked like survival mode. It looked like guilt. Depending on who you asked, it looked like both. The story that had lived in lyrics and live streams evaporated from public view in a single weekend, and the silence that followed felt louder than any statement he could have given. Meanwhile, every loose thread people had been pulling became evidence. A lyric turned into a breadcrumb. A timestamp turned into a map. A photo backstage became complicity. The investigation didn't need the internet's help, but it got it anyway. Millions of posts acting like magnifying glasses, burning holes in anything that didn't fit the theory. And each new rumor landed like a hammer, whether it was nailed down or not. If the story had ended there, it would have been brutal and simple. A fall from grace with no room for doubt. But that's not what happened. The twist came from the one place no one expected, the family, when a brother stepped forward and insisted the timeline wasn't what it seemed. When the noise was at its loudest, the quietest voice in the room cut through it. His brother Caleb. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't name names. He just pushed one idea into the center of the table. The timeline everyone swore was airtight might not be what it looks like. With that, the ground shifted. If the dates were wrong, if the links were staged, then the story people had already decided was missing pieces, maybe planted, maybe misread. Silence made it worse. Caleb didn't flood feeds with clarifications or clapbacks. He left a gap big enough for the internet to fill, and it did exactly that. Threads pulled his verses apart like wires, searching for hidden jabs and veiled warnings. Grainy backstage photos reappeared with circles and arrows, claiming he stood too close to someone he should have been nowhere near. Some said he was trying to clear his own name before the room filled with badges. Others called him the ultimate traitor, the kind that smiles on stage and takes meetings off it. Official lines stayed thin. No confirmations, no denials, just the kind of silence that turns speculation into sport. Was he helping investigators connect the dots? Was he pushing back against a narrative that moved too fast? Or was he doing both, protecting himself while nudging the truth into daylight? The answers never came, and that's what made the question stick. Caleb hadn't just entered the story. He had become the story's mirror, reflecting either loyalty or survival, depending on who was looking. And the instant he raised doubt, the rest of the case splintered into two parallel timelines. The one the feds were building behind closed doors, and the one the internet was improvising in real time. Between them ran a single thread. If you can bend perception, you can bend everything. But perception wasn't the only thing being tested. The rumor machine was just warming up. The first explosion came from a single viral post on X. It wasn't careful, it wasn't sourced, it didn't need to be. It claimed Celeste was pregnant, and that remains tied to an infant had been found near his orbit. The numbers surged, millions of views by morning. Blogs lifted the claim. Fan pages echoed it as if it were already in a report. Grief turned to horror. Outrage hardened into certainty. Then the reversal hit. Investigators through channels that rarely speak in absolutes pushed back. No forensic confirmation, no official source, no report. The claim collapsed under its own weight, but online retractions never travel as far as the original blast. The damage stuck to him anyway. Another shadow added to a profile already painted in the darkest color. Next came the family backlash. Screenshots started circulating of an aunt posting selfies and shoutouts under hashtags tied to a funeral. Some said it was clout chasing, others said it was coping in the worst possible light. Either way, the optics broke people. When tragedy looks like branding, the crowd doesn't forgive. Overnight, the story widened from one artist's descent to a family's credibility on trial. With each rumor, the case turned into a maze where every turn sounded true. Half of it was fiction, the other half was fuel. fury, and yet buried under the shouting, there were still the only things that actually matter in a case like this. Logs, warrants, verified timelines, the kind of facts that don't need a hashtag to exist. That's why some people started asking hard questions about the noise itself. Was it accidental chaos from a million hot takes, or something more deliberate? False leads flooding the zone so the real trail stayed cold? Because while the internet argued about babies, selfies, and loyalty, the clearest through line was still the one most people ignored. The paper trail didn't care about trending topics. Parking citations, tow records, lab results, chain of custody forms, none of it needs a like button to hold up in a courtroom. And yet the theories kept multiplying. That's when listeners turned back to the art, convinced the answers weren't in a thread at all, but buried in songs, symbols, and a voice that didn't belong to him. Once people stopped arguing about threads and started listening, the songs felt different. Lines that once read like teenage heartbreak began to sound like timestamp. Not proof, not a confession, but patterns you can't unhear once someone points them out. It started with the interview. He framed the project like a diary cracked open, talking about pain, beauty, and saying goodbye as if the track list was a letter he couldn't send. In the moment, it was just art talk. In hindsight, it felt like a primer. Here's how to read me. Listeners went back and noticed how often he connected love with endings, how he described chapters closing, eras shifting, and the idea of returning to where I came from. At the time, it sounded poetic. After the trunk, it felt like foreshadowing. Then came the flower. Fans latched onto the lily motif and it spread fast. In certain cultures, the red spider lily shows up in stories about partings and the last walk home, a symbol tied to loss, funerals, and the line between here and gone. He didn't spell any of that out. He didn't have to. Once the title cues were there, people filled the blanks. The release windows lined up with a season people didn't want to think about. The bloom matched the timeline everyone feared. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe he'd been threading a metaphor through the whole arc and hoping nobody would pull it. The voice moments landed harder. In a couple of tracks, listeners swear you can hear her on the line, voicemail snippets where she sounds worn out, apologizing, asking him to fix whatever was wrong with him, not her. It didn't play like a duet, it played like evidence of a bond that frayed in public while the worst parts stayed off camera. Whether those clips were authentic or spliced or staged didn't matter to the crowd. The effect was the same. The music started to feel like a documentary without credits. A darker cut added fuel. He laid out a couplet about being eaten alive day by day, letting something chase him he couldn't shake. It read like doom in slow motion. Fans called it guilt talking through a pop filter. Critics called it a teenager dabbling in edge. Either way, the line hooked into the narrative and refused to let go. Live shows didn't calm anyone down. Twice in 2025, he broke on the same song, voice cracking, words failing, stage lights catching, the kind of silence that makes a room hold its breath. Some said it was grief. Others heard confession catching in his throat. When the same track wrecks you more than once, people start to ask why that one? Why that lyric? Why right there? Even the tattoos and artwork turned into talking points. Symbols that once looked cool suddenly carried weight. A single image could launch 100 theories. Was he paying tribute, admitting loss, or hiding a message in plain sight because the guilt needed an outlet somewhere? By then, the reading had shifted. It wasn't is there meaning, it was how much did he want us to find? Because the release dates, the motifs, the voicemails, the onstage breaks, together they didn't feel random. They felt like a trail you'd only notice after the last breadcrumb was already eaten. Maybe he wanted to be understood. Maybe he wanted to be caught. Or maybe it was exactly what art always is. A mirror that looks incriminating only when you already believe the worst. What the songs didn't answer, the people around him made louder, and that's where the conversation turned from personal to systemic. Who knew, who looked away, and who started cleaning the scene the moment the lights came on? By the time fans finished combing through lyrics, the lens zoomed out and what it showed looked less like one person's spiral and more like an ecosystem that refused to hit pause. The spotlight moved to management, the label, and anyone who touched the brand. When investigators hit a residence tied to his camp, people didn't see cooperation, they saw proximity, and proximity looked like knowledge. The timing felt like a siren. Days after Celeste was identified, a door opened for law enforcement, and suddenly the conversation wasn't just what did he do, but who kept this running while the alarms were blaring. Online sleuths pushed a brutal thesis. They were warned and they looked away. Threads claimed that as early as 2024, whispers about a missing minor were already hitting inboxes. If that's true, then every backstage sighting becomes harder to defend. She was photographed behind the scenes, surrounded by adults who didn't have to be detectives to notice she wasn't old enough to be there. People talked about fake IDs, about winks and nods, about the kind of willful ignorance that follows a rising revenue line. It's ugly math, but it's familiar. When the numbers go up, the standards go down. Then came the paperwork optics that the internet reads like tea leaves. After the LAPD went through his place, word spread that a lease tied to him was terminated at speed. To some, that looked like routine business. To others, it looked like a mop popping out of a supply closet. Hours later, the label cut every visible cord. Playlists cleared, campaigns iced, projects vaporized. No public wrestling with the facts, just decisive distance. It read like damage control, keep the brand spotless, even if the truth is still in transit. Fans seized on the silence from the top. No round table, no reckoning, no this is how we missed it, just a swift pivot and a missing name on the roster. Meanwhile, the receipts people really wanted weren't statements, they were answers. Who cleared the backstage wristbands? Who looked at a birth year and let the laminate pass? Who knew about the missing person report before it hit the news, and what did they do after they knew? Those questions bled across comment sections, and every non-answer felt like an answer of its own. The broader indictment was simple and devastating. This wasn't just one artist breaking, it was an entire support system choosing the show over the stop sign. Managers manage risk, labels manage image, publicists manage narrative. Fans argued that in this case, everyone managed to keep the money flowing until the trunk forced the music to cut. By the time the machine finally powered down, it was too late to look principled. The tour was gone, the pages were scrubbed, the business ties severed in record time, but it all felt like a fire drill after the building had already burned. That's why the criticism stuck. Not because a company can't pull the plug quickly, but because it took the worst headline imaginable to find the socket. And while the system tried to disappear the mess, the family drama did the opposite. It stepped into the light, which is where the story folded back on itself, right to the one person whose silence had become its own kind of statement. Caleb. Every family has a fault line. Theirs ran straight through two brothers who shared a stage and a last name, then landed on opposite sides of the public's trust. Caleb didn't raise his voice, he raised doubt, and doubt is louder than any denial. The moment he suggested the timeline might be bent or worse, built, the audience split. To some, he became the one person brave enough to challenge a story that moved too fast. To others, he looked like a man edging away from a blast he helped wire. That's the paradox nobody could shake. If Caleb was right, then the neat chain of dates and clips wasn't a confession, it was a trap. If he was wrong or strategic, then the nudge he gave the narrative wasn't about truth at all. It was about survival, and survival changes how a person sounds. You stop explaining, you start editing. You don't argue in comments. You let the internet do what it does best, talk itself into believing you might know something they don't. The threads treated his catalog like an affidavit. Lines that once felt like brotherly rivalry turned into veiled warning. Features were replayed like wiretaps. A grainy photo backstage became a thesis. If he was near her, he knew. If he knew, why say nothing? If he said nothing, why speak now? That spiral didn't need facts to spin, it only needed momentum, and momentum is the internet's favorite fuel. Meanwhile, the silence from official channels did the one thing it always does. It made everything sound plausible. Cooperation? Maybe. Damage control? Maybe. A man caught between blood and the truth? That too. The longer Caleb held the line, the more his absence felt like an answer. People projected meaning into every non-statement, and the story grew teeth where there were only shadows. In the end, the question wasn't, is Caleb loyal? It was loyal to what? To family, even if it's broken. To a version of events he believes is real. To the instinct to step out of the blast radius before it widens. Maybe all three at once. Either way, his move changed the current. It didn't clear anyone. It didn't convict anyone. It did something harder. It made certainty impossible. And that's where the story has lived ever since, in the space between what people think they know and what the paper trail can actually prove. Which is why the final stretch matters most, stripping the noise back to the few things that are truly known and the question that will stick after the credits roll. Strip away the rumor smoke and a few hard edges remain. A teenage girl who'd been reported missing was found in the trunk of a Tesla registered to a rising artist. Detectives impounded the car, executed warrants, and began building a case that has not yet produced public charges. A tour vanished, industry ties snapped, and a community buried a child while the official cause of death stayed sealed. Those are the facts. Everything else, lyrics as clues, symbols as signals, family silence as strategy, lives in the gray where the internet loves to camp. That gray is where narratives multiply. One version says the music was a breadcrumb trail and the timeline is the map. Another says the timeline bends under real scrutiny. That perception outran proof, and that noise was pumped into the system until even clear lines looked crooked. Somewhere between those poles sits the paper trail that doesn't argue. Toe slips, logs, timestamps, lab work. If this ever reaches a courtroom, that's the language that will speak. What the songs and interviews offer is mood, the ache of endings, the fixation on partings, the weight of a goodbye he couldn't name. Maybe it was art, nothing more. Maybe it was a mirror he couldn't stand to look into without flinching. The truth doesn't need metaphor, it needs evidence. But when evidence takes time, metaphors step in and start doing a job they were never built for. And then there's the family fault line. Caleb's single push, the timeline isn't what it seems, didn't clear anyone or condemn anyone. It did something more disruptive. It made certainty feel reckless. Loyalty and survival rarely wear name tags, and the silence between them can sound like guilt, courage, or both, depending on who's listening. So here we are, a closed casket, an open investigation, and a story most people will remember in fragments. Songs that suddenly feel heavier, a car that should have been ordinary, a brother who said just enough to split the room. If the gray ever lifts, it won't be because a lyric decoded itself or a thread guessed right. It'll be because the dull, stubborn facts lined up and refused to move. Until then, one question hangs over everything, louder than any theory. When the noise dies down and the record stops spinning, what survived? The story the internet wrote or the truth the evidence can prove? If you made it this far, you see why this story refuses to sit still. It's grief wrapped in speculation, art tangled with inference, and a timeline everyone wants to claim. We can debate symbolism, argue over screenshots, and read meaning into every pause, but none of it replaces the slow grind of facts. A family is mourning. Detectives are working. The rest of us are left with a lesson the internet keeps forgetting. Volume isn't proof, and certainty without evidence is just echo. Here's where I'll leave you. If the paper trail confirms the theory, then the songs weren't poetry, they were warnings we missed. If it doesn't, then we'll have to reckon with how easily rumor can smother a life and a legacy before the truth arrives. Either way, the only honest position right now is a hard one. Hold space for the lost, keep your mind open, and let the evidence do the talking when it finally speaks. If you want a deeper dive into the verified timeline versus the fan-built one, drop timeline in the comments with the detail you want checked next. And if you found this breakdown useful, tap subscribe, hit like, and share it with someone who needs the signal more than the noise.